like to introduce our first guest, which happens to be a pre-recorded virtual guest. Unfortunately, this gentleman could not be here with us tonight, but he took time out of his very busy schedule to have a conversation with the three of us on this topic of critical race theory. We have with us today Anthony Watson, who has quite a laundry list of amazing things that he's done. He is our Turning Point USA ambassador. He is a PragerU member for Prager Force. He is also a 2018 Olympian, and he is busy training for the 2022 and 2026 Milan and Beijing Olympian Games. So he is a skeleton racer, which if you don't know what that is, you should Google it because it is quite the sport. Head first down super speeding slide. I don't know if the word slide is correct. He'll correct me, I'm sure, but quite the sport. So Anthony is with us today because he's going to give us his views on a couple very, very important and scary things that are going on right now. So without further ado, thank you, Anthony, for being with us today, and give us what you're all about. Let me hear it.
Well, thank you so much, ladies, for having me. And to everybody else that's here, I apologize that I couldn't make it in person. I had a lot of previous engagements, so I'm really happy to sit here and just share a little bit about who I am and what I've been doing to help join you in the fight that we're all in right now. And so a little bit about myself is that, yes, I'm a Winter Olympian, and you don't see many Black people in winter sports because we don't like snow or the cold. But the few of us that actually do enjoy competition, that's how I found skeleton. So I was originally trying to be an athlete for track and field, and then had a serious knee injury that kept me from competition. And so afterwards, I looked up and saw that bobsled and skeleton was the only Olympic sport that took tryouts. And so I tried out and competed with Team USA for 3 years, and didn't get to go to the Sochi Games because I didn't qualify and I was too new in the sport at the time. And so I switched through dual citizenship to my father's country, who immigrated here legally from Jamaica. And now I'm representing my mother's country of Puerto Rico in the sport of skeleton, looking to be the first ever Olympian to make history twice, because I was the first ever Jamaican in Olympic history to compete in the 2018 games in my sport. And now I'm looking to represent another small nation that's never been represented in a Winter Olympics before. I'm here today to come and share with you guys my thoughts and opinions on everything that's happening, and let you guys know that you guys aren't alone in this fight and that we're all going to get this done together.
I had a question for you, and as you know, it's a hot topic for CRT. And since we're a little older, we have children of our own, I wanted to get your perspective on what you know about it, your exposure and your thoughts on CRT.
Well, I've been out of school for a while. I'm 31, so I'm not that much younger than you young group of ladies. So but what I've been told so far about critical race theory is that it's quote unquote a level playing field for people of minorities, or people specifically of color that look like myself, more so from the perspective of telling people that everything is not fair and everything is stacked against them, and literally in subtle ways telling them that you'll never be able to have a job because the system is racist. You know, white people are going to have more opportunities than you. You're never going to be able to live in a house, get a bank loan, have a career and everything, all because of your skin color. And, sadly, there's no truth to any of that. But the thing I think that makes me the most upset is how gullible and how easy it was for it to get into schools. And now that parents have seen the actual material and see what it's about, that's what I guess has everybody so alarmed. But I tell people all the time that the reason this happened, and I feel like the reason parents should have started protesting, was when they started taking prayer and God out of schools. Because when you don't have a structure that you follow in an authoritative position like the way God does and how he orders and orchestrates things, then it's left up to whatever people can use as a tool to essentially get what they want, which inevitably leads me to say, as a person of color, that critical race theory is just white hating. It's teaching everybody that's a minority, everybody that's not white, that everything white is evil. Every person that's white is evil. Everything, like Caucasian, whatever the backstory, history, or relationship to that is all evil because there's this greater white person and this white power that is somehow systematically putting down the black race and the minority race, which makes no sense to me because a lot of these people that are pushing it are these black Democrat, these black, liberal leaders, these like Hispanic liberal leaders that are all in high positions of power. And so I'm like,
Exactly.
how all of a sudden are you going to now tell all people that look like you that the system is stacked against them when you're sitting in the highest position that anyone could ever make, which is legislation? So
Right.
that's never made sense to me, but that's my view and what I know critical race theory to be. So I feel like the reason we're in this is we live in a selfish, self-centered society now that has tainted the view of the world to make it more comfortable for yourself through lies, deceit, and greed, that now anybody that wants to actually give to other people for no reason, but just for the simple cause of being a good human, now we're the ones that are demonized and told that we're the problem.
I wanted to ask you, I know you probably spend so much time traveling and talking to young people through PragerU and Turning Point. What are kids saying? Do they talk about it? What's your viewpoint on how they're feeling about it?
Part of the people that I talk to are Caucasian people, and the thing that I say to them, and I think the common thing that I hear now is that they're afraid to be anything except compliant because to do so in these days is just like admitting that you're racist. And I'm just like, see, this is the danger of slapping racism on everything, because whenever you actually experience true racism, it's so generalized and so blanketed on everything that it's hard to tell what's serious and real as opposed to what's just made up. And you have so many people fabricating racist situations that it's like now nobody really believes anything that's happening. And what that does is it just breeds a nesting ground for destruction where a lot of people are going to be violent, a lot of people are going to be abusive, and there's really nobody going to be able to do anything or even differentiate the difference between it because it's so overused. So my response and what I've heard a lot from them is just like, we're afraid to say stuff because, like, we're not racist and like we don't think we're racist. I'm just like, look, if you were racist, you'd know, because I said y'all wouldn't be listening to me speak up here. And
Right.
so
Right.
I was in Kansas last week and the first speak to this beautiful crowd of Caucasian people and not worry that a lynch mob is going to be waiting for me outside. I was like, the world is not as dark as people are making it seem. And I tell people that you need to take a stand. And I said, if you're hiding behind your social media followers, like your schools or any of these other institutions that a lot of people have been using as a safe haven, I was like, they're not safe anymore. I was like, all of this stuff is invading everywhere. And I was like, you're being censored, you're being shut up, you're being shut down, you're being locked out of everything. But I said, there have been people that have made a lot more change with absolutely zero of these tools. I said, and that's been people that refuse to let their minds and their hearts be bought or be invaded by lies. So I was like, there's more than 5 of you in here. And I said, it took a handful of people in the beginning of history to come together and say, we're tired of this. And I said, because 5 people took a stand, I said, secretly, there were like 15 people that felt the same way that were just a little too afraid. Then 15 turned into 45, 45 to 90, and the numbers keep growing. And I said, that's what you're starting to see now as people that aren't waking up. They've known the truth, but now they realize that staying quiet isn't helping, and now they're all speaking up. But the response has been very positive, because you have a lot of people now that are afraid to like say anything because of how it'll be. And in the world we live in now, you start seeing that everywhere, is that like you don't even get a chance to defend yourself before you're defamed on the internet, before your picture's posted everywhere, before you're doxxed and your address is given out, and you have people at your house ready to march you to the stake to burn you alive. And so my message has been clear. It's just like, you have to be willing to take a stand for that, even if that's the consequence. And that's what I've done, which is why I've landed in the situation that I'm in right now, where nobody will touch me, support me, or fund me because of, I'm not somebody that they can use.
Message, I'm sorry, to get to our minority community. So I'm Dominican and my parents came here, legal immigrants as well. And I think when you're raising a generation of people and tell them that they're victims, how do they know that they can do better? If they're believing the lie, you're raising a generation of kids and that are hopeless There's nothing for me. This is it because of my skin color. And there's nothing from it's the furthest thing from the truth. At one point in our country, the 3 highest office in the lands were held by Black men: Obama, Eric Holder, and Justice Clarence Thomas. I mean, that's amazing, but nobody wants to talk about that. So as a Dominican person, you know, I'm very obviously an advocate.
You froze for a second,
You froze,
Cynthia.
but if I'm piecing it together, I guess you're saying from a minority community, what would my message be to people that are struggling believing those kinds of things and whatnot? You're going to be a victim. I was just like, there's no hope there. That's why everyone feels terrible, because it's just like, you know, when somebody else comes into power, then you have to replay your victimhood and you have to see if they're going to continue all this other stuff for you, and you have to do all this. When you play victim, you're always relying on somebody else to help you get ahead. And sometimes people will help you out of fear, and other times people will just leave you to the side and be like, forget it. But when you're a victor, that means no matter who's in power, no matter who's saying what, no matter what I look like or where I come from, if I use hard work, discipline, good choices, integrity, wisdom, and faith, I can literally accomplish anything. Look at me. I was like, I am a Black winter Olympian. I sat in my dad's lap at the young age of 6, and I told him that I wanted to do that. He told me 3 things. He said, if you trust God, you work hard, and you have faith, you will literally see yourself go places in the world that you never expected yourself to go. I have never gone anywhere in the name of Black. I have never gone anywhere in the name of my race. Because when I'm competing with people that come from all over the place, that are coming from different races and whatnot. And racism isn't just Black versus white. That's what we've made it to be. We've made it to where race is strictly, oh, well, you're a Black person, and so every person that's white's going to come from this and that, when people don't realize that it's just like, look, Black people suffer more under Black people than they do white people, you know, and nobody ever has that conversation, because to have that conversation means that people actually have to admit to it and own up to it and take accountability for something that they have no control over. And, you know, I'm just like, you have no control over who's going to say what to you, how people are going to respond. The only 2 things in your life that you have absolute 100% control over is what you say and do to other people, and how you respond to what is said and done to you. Out of those 2 things, there is absolutely nothing that you can control, nothing that you can foreshadow, nothing you see coming, nothing that you can, you know, like have a vision about, that kind of thing. It's just like, outside of that.
How did you get involved, and what would you say to somebody that's about, like, I have a daughter that's ready to go to college, so does Cynthia, and how would you recommend that I, as a mom, try to steer? Obviously I've taught my kids, but what would your advice be to try to get kids to kind of stay in more of a path of caring and civic duty, and trying to be more involved in a society that's so social media based? How did you get involved in that? Do you have any words for that?
Well, how I got involved in that was, I had very intentional parents. I had parents that cut my TV time down. We grew up without TV most of my life, but whenever we had the opportunity to do that, they made sure, before we had any type of privilege to like watch television or do anything, which was normally just regulated to like watching Wheel of Fortune, Jeopardy, and maybe a couple of 90s sitcoms like Full House and Family Matters, at the end of the day was, you know, all your homework is done, you know, like you read for a little bit, you know, and you know, different things like that. But in the world we live in now, everything seems to be on the internet. But what I tell people, and I speak to a lot of parents, and a lot of parents are just like, I have a son, what am I supposed to do? I'm just like, look, I said, look, every life is its own, but I said, this is where you trust God the most. I said, you live out what you want to be seen and done in your children, because I said, they're going to follow your example. You don't try to hide them away from everything, but I said, when they're exposed to it, you give them the truth and you show them what the truth is. You know, there are going to be a lot of people vying for their attention, and some of it you have to let them know it's just like, it's not worth your time. And so that's the part that I love doing, is because where some of these people have come from single parent homes, foster homes, that kind of thing. And I'm just like, look, I'm proof that by doing things the other way is hard. But I was just like, look where I've gotten now. I've gotten to where nobody can say anything about me because I've earned it. And that's why I've taken a stand saying what I've said and doing what I've done, because if nobody else is going to take a stand for their kids, I will. because that's the future. And they realize that, because us right here, they know that they can't change our minds. We're set in our ways.
Right.
But if they start it subtly, like, oh, if Jamal sits here and it's because Susie doesn't want to be his friend because he's black, that kind of thing. And they're doing it in subtle ways like that, where anyone knows that at their age, they don't know what racism is. They don't even know where like Africa is at that age, you know? So
Right.
to be taught and told that because so-and-so is this and that, it's just like, look, we're Americans and we're doing all this stuff here. You know, that's the real danger behind
I
it.
would like to thank you personally. I appreciate it. I know this isn't the end of our relationship with you. We'll definitely, hopefully work together in the future for sure.
Oh, we definitely will. So thank you so much for the
Anthony.
donation to my GoFundMe. That was unexpected, but it's always appreciated. So
Yeah. You're awesome,
the-
Anthony.
stay
Good luck to
alive.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you
thank you
very
so
much,
much. We
ladies.
appreciate everything you're doing. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
definitely.
You've got a fighter and a friend in me. So whenever you need me, just call.
We are so fortunate, in my opinion, to have our next guest. Miss Maron, Maud Maron, is someone that we found when looking for curriculum. Like I said, we at Women United are not against diversity. We're not against inclusion. We're not against equality. We're not racist. We believe everybody matters. We stand firmly in those beliefs. However, like I said earlier, how we get there, how we get to this new mandate that Governor Murphy put in place for our state, which is diversity and inclusion, is up for debate and conversation. And like I said, conversation makes you move forward, right? Screaming, yelling, being angry, that's not gonna get us anywhere, right? We have enough of that in this country, right? So when we were looking at curriculums, we came up with Fair for All. And you know, Maud will talk about that as well. And the bottom line is, it's a pro-human lens in getting those buzzwords, all those talking points, across with a pro-human filter, pro-human lens, if you will. So who Maud Maron is, she is an advocate. Very simple. What does that mean? It means you are a person that stands up. You are a person that stands up for others that can't stand up for themselves or don't have the means to stand for themselves. Maud Maron has been, I should say, a lifelong Democrat, a socialist, voted for Bernie Sanders, just outed you. But Bernie's a good guy. You know, that's who I'm gonna, you know, present to you in a few moments, and I'm not gonna sit here. She could talk about her life far better than I. But she is gonna deliver information to you from a completely different and unique view, coming from that background. She, you know, advocated with Planned Parenthood. She stood by Black Panthers. I mean, this is who we have. So when attacks were kind of thrown towards our camp a little bit, towards Women United, you know, with comments of racism or standing by white people, what do they know about race, what they can talk to us about race. I mean, quite frankly, she is the other side in many ways. She defended people that could not defend themselves, some of the most underprivileged Black and brown people in New York City. So without further ado, I'd like to thank Maud Maron for spending her evening with us and sharing her time, her knowledge, and please, again, hold your questions until she asks for them. And first and foremost, respect. Thank you so much. Maud.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. And thank you to Cynthia, Danielle, and May for the invitation. So, so tonight the topic that I received was what exactly is CRT, critical race theory, and how does it impact our children? So, great question, because for all the conversation that we've had about CRT nationally and in the news and everything, it still is something that I think a lot of people have a hard time defining. And I'll say this, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself as I go on, but just to jump in, I'd say I've been fighting critical race theory for many years now. I just didn't know it. I didn't really know it when I started. And how is that? You're like, how the heck could you be fighting against something if you didn't know you were doing it? Well, I'm a New York City public school parent. I have 4 kids in the New York City public schools. And at this point, my kids are 15, 13, 11, and 4. But as I mentioned, this started a while ago. All my kids were in elementary school in Greenwich Village. I live in Lower Manhattan. And, you know, I got involved in my schools. And the way, one of the animating issues in schools for me and for other parents here was how to improve the curricula of schools, how to improve instruction, how to improve, to make some of our schools, we have some very, very good schools in New York City, and we have some that are not so good. How to make sure that all kids have access to stronger academics. So you think, okay, well that sounds great. Who's going to disagree with that? You're not fighting against critical race theory if that's what you're doing. But the truth is, once you start to learn about the folks who are, there's a big broad range of things that I think fall under critical race theory, but one of the sort of a through line is the idea that all racial disparities between groups is the result of racism or racist policy. So how does that, you know, how does that impact in the school conversation? If you have a merit-based admissions, like you have to take a test to get into a school, or you have to, you know, meet certain academic criteria, and you have more Asian kids than Black kids getting into that school system, well, if you believe all racial disparities are the result of racist policy or racism, you say, well, that test is racist, right? That process that you've designed is racist. And then what we saw in New York time and time again was, well, let's dismantle that. Let's get rid of that, because I think we can all agree that racism is a horrible thing. Anthony's certainly right, it exists in the world today. People have to face and deal with racism. So if you say something's racist, the impulse to get rid of it is pretty strong. What we've seen again and again in the school system fights that we've had as parents is that when you try to say, well, maybe the test isn't racist, right? Maybe this test isn't the problem. Maybe there are other things that we have to fix in our school system, like we have to ask ourselves, why so few Black students are reading on grade level or doing math on grade level? That's a pretty reasonable question to ask. It's become a scary question to ask for a lot of parents, right? Because you can get in trouble, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of the trouble I've been in. But what, you know, what happens is people get silenced, right? Because who wants to be called racist? It's an awful, terrible accusation to have leveled your way. And when the conversation stops being about how are we going to solve for disparities that are real and that we see and that we want to change, how are we going to solve for that? When the conversation stops being around that and just becomes accusations towards people, the whole conversation shuts down. So in New York, what we saw was this, this idea of calling racial disparities evidence of racism has resulted in an attack on what we in New York called our specialized high schools. It's high schools you have to test into. They have essentially dismantled the gifted and talented program in New York. It was under assault with this very same ideology. And individual schools have been losing their honors math program. I don't know in what universe when over 50% of kids can't read, write, or do math on grade level, do you think, oh, let's take a successful honors program that several kids are doing well in and many families want more of and get rid of it? Getting rid of it is not the answer. And this, by the way, is not unique to New York, right? We have seen the same attack on merit-based admissions in San Francisco, in Boston, in Virginia, and in other places, because the answer of get rid of it, which also, by the way, conveniently hides the failures that are not the failures of kids, right? The 4-year-old, the 8-year-old, the 10-year-old who can't read, it's not that child's failure. We are the adults, we are the teachers, the administrators, the parents. We're responsible for designing a system that can help children learn how to read. So, so I said I'd tell you a little bit, just out of curiosity, how many people had a moment to Google me or know anything about me before they came tonight? Just a few, so I'll give you a little tiny background. So I was like I said, I was a public school parent, and I ran for what is a school board in New York City. We call it a community education council, but it functions like I grew up in Pennsylvania, so it functions like what we call school boards in the rest of the world, the rest of the country. And my school board, like any other, would meet in auditoriums and debate the issues of our local school district. My friend Vincent Hahn joined me in the second term that I was on the school board, and the term that Vincent and I sat on that school board together. We had this sort of bizarre experience that's been chronicled online and been chronicled in some magazine articles. There's this interesting Atlantic article about it where we were virtual once COVID started, and in one of our virtual meetings, one of the members of our council, who's a white man, held a friend's child on his lap, and the child was black, which seems like a pretty normal thing to happen. My kids have been in and out of my Zoom screens occasionally, so kids, when you're at home, you have people in your Zoom world make appearances sometimes. Over 100 parents signed a letter demanding that I resign from the school board because I had tolerated this racist act of the white man holding the black baby on his lap. I know some of you are thinking there has to be more to the story. That absolutely can't be what happened, and I'll share it with Cynthia and Danielle, and they can forward it, but there's a very smart Atlantic article about this crazy meeting. But you can only understand it. You can only understand the insanity of this bizarre accusation if you understand that the people who are leveling the accusation have been deeply steeped in critical race theory, tenets, and ideas. The popular books are, of course, Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, or his book Stamped, and Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. Right? If you read those books and you accept as true some of the ideas that they put forth, then you can these ideas will start to make sense to you about how white people are guilty of racism regardless of what you do. It's sort of an intrinsic thing that all white people have, this racist, belief system. And so I had that sort of rather bizarre experience where our meetings, which usually, if we had a big meeting, there'd be 30 people in a room, and then once we went to Zoom, maybe we had 300 because people could sign on much more easily. And then all of a sudden we had 500,000 people downloading this crazy meeting where everyone was screaming and yelling at each other about the racism of the white guy holding the black baby. And these are people that just are screaming and yelling at each other and fighting about insanity instead of solving the very real problems that we have in our school system. That was the start of my getting people very angry at me, that school term and sitting on that board. And then later what happened is I decided to run for city council. And so I was running for city council in Lower Manhattan. I was running as a Democrat. I'm still running, but I'm running as an independent now. I wrote an op-ed sharing some of the beliefs that I've just shared with you all now about how we need to work on improving schools. And disagreeing with, I attended an anti-bias training that was put on by the New York City Department of Education. I was unimpressed with some of the things that they focused on because it sort of buys into this critical race theory idea. And I objected to it, and I wrote about my objections. My employer, the Legal Aid Society, or I should say the most left-leaning, most radical, most critical race theory adopting voices within my place of work, were very offended or very outraged by my op-ed, by my daring to have an opinion that's different from theirs. And they wrote public letters saying that that what I did harmed my clients because, as Danielle said, I was a public defender. You represent low-income people, many, many minority clients in a city like New York City. And they said that my perspective harmed my clients. It harmed Black and brown clients. And they said that there was a mandate within the workplace to be anti-racist. And again, we are all, I'm sure I can speak confidently on behalf of this room full of people who I have not met and don't know, that we are all anti-racist in that we are opposed to racism. But anti-racism, as it's defined by Ibram Kendi, has these prescriptions. So it says you must remedy past discrimination with present discrimination. I disagree with that. And I think anyone who disagrees with those concepts and ideas should certainly be free in an American workplace to say, I disagree, I have a different idea. Let's go get a cup of coffee and talk about it, right? Like, that's something we should be able to do. in terms of parents and school systems sort of fighting against critical race theory, the way it started to look like in my experience was, and several of the parents that I work with, was really started with standing up for the academics in the school. And what you found is that the more you would talk about academics, these equity terms would come back to you. And there, I asked Danielle and Cynthia to print out a cheat sheet that we have. That is one-sided. It really is saying like that is, you know, but it's an interesting point of view, as if you are skeptical of CRT and you're skeptical of the equity language that's made it into your schools, what do people really mean when they're saying equity, like anti-racism, if you take the dictionary definition of it, it's fairness. Well, I want fairness in my school, in my workplace, but equity as a term of art that's being used in our schools is often this concept that's being used to dismantle academic programs. So it can't just mean fairness, right? It has to mean something else. So there's a cheat sheet that kind of said, for the die-hard CRT supporters, what does the language really mean? So it's at least thought-provoking. You don't have to agree with every word of it, but it's thought-provoking and interesting. So what we found was this equity conversation was being used to dismantle these programs. So that's one part of where I saw CRT being negative in our schools. But the other part, right, the attack on merit is very, very troubling. But for me, the other part that was really troubling was the way in which these concepts were affirmatively coming into our schools. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is when it was really interesting to hear what Anthony was saying, because it's saying there's a group of people that are oppressors and a group of people who are oppressed. And you don't get to choose which group you're in. We're going to tell you what group you're in, and it depends on the color of your skin. And I think telling that to really, really young children is horrible. And I think I see it as kind of stealing the innocence of childhood that I don't like, and that more than don't like, I just think it's wrong in every way. Because I have a 5-year-old son right now, and he's my 4th kid, so I've been a mom to 5-year-olds before, and I know how fast it goes by, and it's just such a beautiful age, and it's so sweet, and it's so innocent. And my son just graduated from pre-K, and he's going into kindergarten, and his 2 little friends that were boys, one is a child who is a biracial child, and one who is a child who is an Asian child, and there were 3 little boys and they looked different, but they played together beautifully, and nobody was going to tell them that the way they had to interact had anything to do with the color of their skin. And if you don't tell them that, it's not going to occur to them. Of course, they live in America, they'll grow up, they'll understand racism is real. Slavery happened in this country, Jim Crow happened in this country. If you go mining our history, we will find an endless number of examples of horrifying racism, right? In all sorts of ways, and we shouldn't shy away from any of that, and we should teach it, and we need to teach it as part of our history. But when you're kids, the way you interact with each other can and should be as peers, as equals, and as friends. And I think any system, and we have these, this curriculum that's being introduced, and it's sometimes called ethnic studies, it's sometimes, in New York City, it's called culturally responsive sustaining education, and I know in New Jersey, you just got new legislation that really doesn't allow for that innocence, that's really insistent on telling a story about racial oppression to kids at a very, very young age that I think is robbing something from our kids. I think they should be able to relate to one another with much more innocence and with much more respect for all the ways in which we're the same and not different from a really young age. So I'll give you an example. Chris Rufo, who is, he and I probably don't come from the same political spectrum because I have been a very left-leaning Democrat all my life, but he was asked, and he's a very conservative-leaning guy, but he's written tremendously about critical race theory, and I will say in his behalf, he brings receipts. He's done a lot of research into the way in which critical race theory trainings and ideas have infiltrated industries and schools. And one of the things, he was asked, what should kids be taught about race in America? And what he said is, Teach honestly about the history of racism and injustice, but place it in the context of America's highest ideals and in our steady progress towards achieving them. Cultivate a sense of agency and common purpose in children of all racial backgrounds. I couldn't agree more with that suggestion. So I also like to just say that parents, I think we have a right to know what's being taught in our schools, and so transparency is super important to me. And you know, I'll give you an example from Zoom, but you know, from being a parent during Zoom, one of my kids was in a Zoom class, and something about Christopher Columbus came up. I couldn't hear the whole thing, but asked my child afterwards, what was that about? And it was like, oh, we're having this conversation about Christopher Columbus, and this kid, you know, I won't say the kid's name, but so-and-so said something, and my child said to me, I thought he was very brave. And I said, well, what did he say that was so brave? And my child said to me, oh, that there were some good things about Christopher Columbus. I said, well, what? Okay, that's interesting. Why was that brave? And my kid said, and I said, what did he say? And my child said to me, oh, that, you know, that yes, Christopher Columbus did some things that were very bad, but also there were some good things about Christopher Columbus, because without Christopher Columbus, we wouldn't be here, and this is a good country, and we're a democracy, and we have these things that are good about this country. And I was thinking, but why was that brave, right? It seemed like a pretty credible argument for a middle schooler to make. This is middle school analysis. And my kid said to me, oh, because you know what the teacher wants you to say. Like, you know what the teacher's point of view is. I want to have classrooms where kids can explore all ideas, where they can advance bad ideas and good ideas, and you try to support your ideas with evidence, and some are going to be more persuasive and some are less persuasive. You can debate it. Is Christopher Columbus a good person or a bad person? Seems like a perfectly reasonable thing for a bunch of 7th graders to talk about, because there are things to support each position, right? And the idea that there's one narrative, you know what it is, the teacher's made it clear what you're supposed to say, and that's all you say, is really cheating kids out of the skills you need to be critical thinkers and to be, you know, to be the kind of well-educated young people that we want our kids to be. So that brings me to what I've been doing and what you guys can do. So I am a founding member of an organization in New York City called PLACE NYC, which is Parent Leaders for Accelerated Curriculum and Education. As I mentioned, we really started we didn't really talk about CRT when we started. We talked about how to improve the academics of our kids' classrooms. And I am also a board of advisors in a group called FAIR, which stands for Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. And I invite you to check out both of our websites. And it's fairforall.org for FAIR, and placenyc.org for place. And let me tell you, the FAIR is a national organization, so it's sort of more relevant to New Jersey folks. Place is very much about New York City public schools. But I'm going to read you the mission statement of FAIR, which is: the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to advancing civil rights and liberties for all Americans and promoting a common culture based on fairness. FAIR has local chapters that have started. We really just started this year, and officially launched on Martin Luther King Day earlier this year. And we're going to be joined by Kenny Xu, who's written this book called The Inconvenient Minority, which is about the battle with Harvard's admission regarding Asian American admission and discrimination in the admissions process. Which is a case that's likely to keep going on a little bit. And myself and Yatin Chu, who's the president, a co-president of PLACE, of our local organization, are going to be speaking with Kenny about his book and about his conversation in New York City, the role of Asian American students has been a wrinkle and a complication in the narrative about systemic racism, because Asian American students are, the Asian American population, like any population, runs the whole span in terms of socioeconomic groups, but as a whole, there's been a lot of recent immigration, and there is Asian Americans as a whole, especially in New York City public schools, is not a rich community. We have a lot of new immigrants who, students who, are not wealthy and have seen phenomenal academic success, who are doing better than a lot of white kids. So the narrative of white kids are privileged and they're only doing well in school because of their unearned privileges, and black students are all oppressed and there's a systemic oppression that's going on, and that's why black kids are not doing well in school. That narrative gets a little bit messed up by a lot of really, really poor Asian kids who parents don't speak English, whose parents are working low income or minimum wage jobs, who are doing better, substantially better sometimes academically than everybody else. I have talked about this before, and you get two things back. People say the model minority myth, and then they say the myth of meritocracy, and they say myth, myth, myth. But those kids aren't myths. They're real kids, and they're doing really well. So I get a little bit tired of having those two slogans thrown at me when we talk about the reality that your theory doesn't hold up. Your theory has some holes in it if I can point to the enormous success that we have here. And let's not dismiss our students' success. I really think we need to celebrate academic success and success of our students when we see it. We talked a little bit about what to do, right? What to do if you see these things happening in your school system, if you think there are things going on where your kids aren't being allowed, if you think your kids, especially older kids that you can talk to, aren't getting the full range of freedom to talk about, to share their ideas in a classroom, or if ideas are being pushed in your classroom and among your teachers, if your fellow PTA parents are like, I don't like the fact that they're bringing in this initiative, but I'm nervous about raising my hand because I don't want people to call me names if I say maybe we shouldn't have that program. So one, come together in groups because finding other like-minded people, and there are, I promise you, other like-minded people in your schools is really important. And I would ask anyone here, if you're interested in learning more about FAIR and maybe starting a FAIR New Jersey chapter, we'd be super happy to talk to you, to meet with you, to tell you about how we can support chapters and what are the resources we have in FAIR to get chapters up and running, because they can be local, it can be statewide, a New Jersey chapter we don't have yet, or it can be local. And then finally, when it comes to kids, I think it's really, really important to talk to them at home, and especially your older kids. Like I said, my eldest two are teenagers, and I think there's something that really borders on indoctrination going on in schools, where they're being told that there's only one way to think about things, and certainly only one way that they're supposed to talk about things. So what I found with my kids, what was helpful, is to watch certain things with them and to talk to them. And then you can just kind of, what do you think about that? The nice open-ended questions. And I'll give you 3 tips that worked for me, 3 suggestions rather that worked for me. One is there's a really beautiful documentary called What Killed Michael Brown. And the hands up, don't shoot narrative that has come out of that case is really explored in this thoughtful, beautiful documentary that is called What Killed Michael Brown. You can, you can get it on Amazon Prime. It's kid appropriate in terms of, I don't know, my 11-year-old, I don't know, but like for teenagers, for older kids, it's a deeply thoughtful, beautiful documentary that I would recommend. And what it does is gives kids an idea, right? It talks a lot about the Black Lives Matter movement and what the Black Lives Matter movement did around that case. And says, is that the truth? Is it accurate? Is what you're being told, accurate? And it asks the questions in a really, really beautiful and thoughtful and interesting way. The other thing that if you can just Google and find on YouTube is the Evergreen series about Brett Weinstein. Brett Weinstein was a professor at a public university in Oregon who was basically chased out of his university because he sort of objected to what is essentially a critical race theory practice that was going on in his university. It's in 3 parts. They're each about a half an hour. I watched the first one with my kids and then the second 2. And they had a lot to say about it. And it was because you get a lot of students, college students who are, most of the documentary is like the iPhone footage of what was going on during this very tumultuous time on the campus. And it was fascinating. And there's also a more traditional documentary called Safe Spaces. And actually the PragerU guy, we heard Anthony talking about PragerU, is there with Adam Carolla, who I really didn't know was doing anything other than he used to be on like a show with Dr. Drew about sex on MTV or something. And then I missed a whole big section of Adam Carolla's career between that and this documentary. Who knew that he was out there doing his thing? But it was a really good documentary. And it's about, you know, safe spaces, this idea, this concept of safetyism, that you can't even introduce an idea that might be upsetting to someone because it might trigger them. They were 3 great things to create conversations with kids. I mean, even if you don't have kids, they were interesting. They were great to watch for just me. But for me, I found them to be really helpful to talk to kids about, because kids don't want to listen to their parents telling them what to think any more than they want to listen to teachers telling them what to think. So this was a way to say, hey, let me expose you to some ideas that you're not hearing in your school, and to give you some language and some ability to kind of, you know, explore these ideas. So that has worked for me as a parent. I share it with anyone here who might think that they want to have those sort of conversations with their kids. And with that, I will wrap it up and certainly be happy to take any questions or move along. It's a great question. I'll say this. Those of us who have these concerns about what's being taught, we're coming late to the party, right? Because in New York City, I mentioned, it's called Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education. Actually, the first people who wanted to boycott me was when I made a statement in the press a few years ago that I had some concerns about culturally responsive sustaining education, which is essentially the codification of critical race theory ideas in our New York City curriculum. So it's out there and it exists. So, you know, there's a long-term plan, which is getting the law changed, you know, but that takes years and years. It takes building support. The shorter term plan, and what we do in New York a lot is, you know, is really local. So here's the thing, there are teachers who have drank the Kool-Aid, who are 100% in this, you know, they believe, you know, systems of oppression, systemic racism, all of this, and they have to teach it to kindergartners. But there's also teachers and administrators and people who work in schools who agree with you but aren't going to wave a flag around telling you they agree with you. So, you know, having respectful conversations in the schools and saying things like, you know, in my kids' elementary school, there was a book that was introduced in, I think, either 1st or 2nd grade that talked about the George Floyd, you know, this last past year that a teacher had written about George Floyd. It was not an appropriate book with, it just was inappropriate for the age group in terms of what, obviously that's an important conversation to have, but, you know, going to the administration, writing your concerns, getting a group of people together and saying, this is an important topic, but there are better and more age-appropriate, more developmentally appropriate, and just showing up again and again and again on the really local level. It doesn't solve the legislatify as something really important, but when enough people on a local level are showing up, what you're doing 2 things. You're solving an immediate problem, like getting a book out of a classroom that's inappropriate, but you're also letting the school and the system know that you're paying attention, that you're watching, that you care, that you're going to be there, and that you're going to keep showing up. And ultimately, I think, you know, the legislation that passed in New Jersey is filled to the brim with buzzwords, but those buzzwords in and of themselves don't have power. What the power is what's actually being taught in your kids' classrooms. So showing up time and time again, 2 PTA meetings, 2 school board meetings. I mean, if you go online right now, there's an endless number of parents showing up at school board meetings saying, and parents of every color, right, saying, don't teach this to my kids. So I think right now there's a real grassroots effort, right, and it's about being present and persistent. Getting polite and respectful, but present and persistent. You have to show up at all of the meetings.
When we spoke before this, we had talked about, so I've been going to the board meetings, you guys probably all know, and I feel like the curriculum is here, something is going to be taught, it's a matter of what is going to be taught. So I've been advocating for the Fair for All program because they teach all these really difficult subjects from a pro-human perspective, and they cover the state standards. I mean, they do everything, you know, but appropriately. when we were talking, since you're an attorney, I had asked, is there a mechanism that would allow a child to opt out of something that they didn't feel comfortable, right? Whether it's something about sexual health or whatever. If there's a subject that a student just says, you know what, I don't feel comfortable with this conversation, can they opt out? Can you talk about that?
So look, there's a clear precedent for opting out of all sorts of things in the schools. There's been a strong opt-out movement of state tests. Across all the states, we've had parents object to, sexual education with people, with kids opting out of different trainings. And it's different in different localities and different places. I happen to think that the opt-out method of dealing with critical race theory in our classrooms is a really, really smart and good one. There was a case in Nevada, and it was a case that it's profiled on the Fair for All website. This mom, Gabrielle Clark, had her son didn't want to participate in, he was in a charter school, and didn't want to participate in what was essentially a critical race theory type training where they separated kids. It was a multiracial family, and so there were kids in the family of different colors, and this child, if I have the facts of the case right, I've heard the mom speak about it, was white, but had non-white siblings. And so when they were saying, like, they call it affinity groups, right? But it's really modern day segregation. It's having our kid, and it's happened in New York City classrooms to kids that I know where they say, we're gonna have the white kids go into this classroom and the non-white kids go into this classroom to talk about an issue, under the idea that somehow you're better off having a conversation when you're separated by race, something I will never see as a good idea in a classroom. And that child objected to it, and they weren't going to graduate him, right? This was a kid with great grades, with extracurriculars, who was going on to, who would have been applying to college, and the fact that he wouldn't participate in this mandatory training was going to prevent him from having the credits he needed, was going to create a real problem for him. They sued, and that case was in federal court. I think it ultimately, it basically settled, and he was able to graduate. But that resistance, there's a model for that, and it starts with opting out, right? And a lot of people are, certainly high school kids who are trying to go to college, it's not always so easy to do that. But that's another area where I happen to think parents should get together. If you have X number of parents in a school, send a letter to a principal that says, we don't want our child to participate in any affinity groups. It's we disagree with, we don't think there's any valid educational purpose to divide our children by skin color. The greater percentage of parents who send a letter or who request a meeting asking for that, the better, right? It does two things. Again, it shows people you're paying attention. The other thing I think that's helpful about that is it gives administrators who know that it's wrong, but who maybe within their own system don't want to be the ones saying, I'm not going to follow the equity initiatives because, people have to keep their jobs and pay their bills. It gives administrators who don't want to go along with something that they might suspect is not the best choice for their kids, it gives them some cover. So it doesn't have to be an adversarial thing with your in some cases it is. If you have a teacher or an administrator or a principal who thinks that this stuff is amazing, it might be perceived as adversarial. But I think a lot of people would be surprised at how much a principal might like getting a letter like that and say, okay, I can't do that. That's not going to work for our classroom because we have too many parents who don't want that to happen. So I think, and again, that's a very case-by-case local analysis. College in the early 90s, and at that time there was a lot of discussion about what's politically correct, and the sort of somewhat facile discussions in our media about political correctness, right? But that political correctness that a lot of people sort of rolled their eyes at or said was ridiculous is something that I think that some of us have had the privilege of ignoring for 2 decades, and while it was growing in academia, what we were rolling our eyes about 20 years ago percolated through academia, and that's where you get these ideas that are so insane that they're going to 5th graders and separating them by race in a classroom and doing it under the idea that they're advancing some sort of equity initiative instead of just saying, well, that's segregation. It's dressed up with new fancy words, but it's just segregation, and as a parent, I don't want my kid participating in it. Of course you're right, and the thing that you say about applying today's up-to-the-minute morality to people in the past is why during the riots we saw last year, we saw statues of Abraham Lincoln being torn down, statues of Frederick Douglass being torn down. We saw this idea that you couldn't possibly be woke enough. You can't be woke enough now, but you certainly couldn't be woke enough if you take today's standards and apply it to people who lived hundreds of years ago. So yes, of course we have to teach our kids about, about morality in the context of the time that people lived in, because there are great people who should be revered, even though they weren't perfect then, and they certainly wouldn't be perfect by today's standards. And good luck on your run on the school board.
Thank you.
Okay, I just want to thank you again. Please, if you have any other questions, write them down. I'll come around with the basket, but in the sake of time, we try to keep our meetings an hour. This was important information, and a lot of it is definitely appreciated, of course. So if you have questions, write them down. You can leave them on the table. We'll come around. But thank you, Maud.
Thank you very much.